Hello, class, and welcome to week 6, War and Technology in the Global War on Terror. So, what we've been exploring throughout this semester is kind of really leading to this week, the idea where technological warfare becomes no longer theoretical, but possible. Right? As we see in law, science, and liberalism, the first Gulf War really marks a shift in the ways in which the US thinks about the role of technology in warfare in order to offer humane, ethical warfare with a quick and decisive victory. So the central dilemma of the book comes to fruition in the 1990s. And so the way the narrative is told is this idea that the horrors of World War II, the massive casualties in the Vietnam War, both on our side and civilian casualties, then was shed through technological innovation by the most humane or ethical war in history in the first Gulf War. A quick and decisive victory, a parade at Disneyland by Storm and Norman Schwarzkopf, and then the eventual improvement of those technologies in smart bombs, drones, and now network-centric warfare and computer and AI systems. So this is the narrative that is told over and over again, that war used to be horrific, but through technological innovation, the US was able to make war more humane. And ultimately, that is where technology takes us, is a war that is bloodless, that is done by robots, kills only the enemies, and does so in a humane way. So throughout my work and what you've been reading in the class, there's kind of this broad theme of linking technology to solving the ethical dilemmas of warfare. And through this paradox of quick and decisive victory and the kind of liberal values of human rights, technology solves this problem. So, how do we understand what the future of war is going to look like, what it means for the kind of ethics of war and the law, and especially what might a future of an AI-enabled battlefield look like? So, throughout my time researching this, and I'll link the paper that I wrote on this topic below, I came to understand that there are a lot of interesting articles that look at hypothetical futures of war with AI, but I really wanted to kind of understand empirically through history how humans and computers interact, because it's not just about the technology itself, what the technology can do. It's about the meaning that humans ascribe to that technology, what we believe it can do. So essentially, I argue that the myth of technology or AI is just as powerful as the technology itself. And it's not just understanding the technology, which I think very few of us do, but in addition to that, understanding the psychology of human-computer interactions. And so what I looked at was this tool known as a collateral damage estimation algorithm that first I became aware of in the early days of the Iraq War. So it was this tool that ultimately colloquially came to be called bug splat. And it was a computer software system that predicted a number of civilian casualties based on the type of bomb size and the target you were hitting. And so the rule was, if there were 30 or more predicted civilian casualties, you needed higher up political approval. It's not that the strike wouldn't take place, but you needed higher up political approval. So in the first days of the 2003 Iraq invasion, also known as the shock and awe campaign, on opening day, the estimations presented to General Tommy Franks indicated that 22 of the 30 projected bombing attacks on Iraq would produce what they defined as heavy bug splat, or more than 30 civilian deaths per raid. To which Franks allegedly responded, "Go ahead, we're doing all 30." And so we see the ways in which this can kind of be a problematic way of viewing the ethics of war, that it's a computer system that now becomes a box to tick rather than a real deliberation about military necessity, about proportionality, and about due care in war. So, just a quick refresher, we talked about ethics of war a little bit earlier, but specifically we're going to talk about jus in bello today, or the ethics of conduct in war. Again, military necessity, what are the objectives you're trying to achieve, needs to be balanced against proportionality to ensure that your strike is proportionate to those goals you're trying to achieve, and also discriminate in that it doesn't directly target civilians, and that you can distinguish between civilians and combatants, but also exercise precaution or due care. And this one's quite important as well. It's the idea that soldiers kind of need to put themselves at some risk in order to prevent civilian casualties, or the precautionary principle, I think, would take us one step further, that you can't just run the algorithm to tick the box, but you really have to kind of weigh and understand. So in the paper I attached, again, you don't have to read it, but if you're interested, there's some really great quotes from it. I explore the evolution of these things known as collateral damage estimation algorithms. And it was really fascinating to kind of see how ethics of war functions in this kind of human-machine interaction. And I think it was helpful in theorizing about what a possible future of war might look like with killer robots. When you look at kind of simple computer software programs, how they've been used in the US Air Force across decades, and what implications that might have for today. So what I found is that some early versions of this software program excuse me, essentially came out of the first Gulf War in the 1990s, where after that, there was a real push in Operation Northern Watch and Southern Watch, or the no-fly zones over Iraq, throughout the entirety of the 1990s and into the first Iraq War in 2003, or the second Iraq War in 2003. There was a desire to have some calculable number for you to be able to see what are the effects on a particular building going to be based on what bomb you drop there. So there was some simple computer modeling that went through that process to see what bomb is going to cause what damage where. So it was a very kind of ad hoc evolution. And this initial thing was known as a collateral damage estimation tool. So this was a computer software package that was helpful, but then they realized as the humanitarian wars of the 1990s, especially the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, started to take place, they also needed to understand how civilian casualties estimate into this. Right? It's because it's not just about what the bomb can do. The idea in a humanitarian war or NATO bombing of Yugoslavia is to protect civilian life. And so what they did was map on population density numbers onto this already existing software program to see a probability of civilian casualties. So at its best, it was able to give you a 3D modeling of a particular target with a particular bomb size and munition to show you what the blast fragmentation would be, and then churn out a number through this process of a predicted number of civilian casualties. So it was used on a handful of targets in the Kosovo bombings. But when the War on Terror came around, this program, CDET, which took 2 or 3 hours to run, was much too slow for an accelerated global war on terror. So they found a way to get it down to 5 to 10 minutes to run, so that you could run it quickly on a number of targets and get an estimate of civilian casualties. But instead of a high fidelity 3D model, what you got instead was this 2D blast pattern, which looked like a bug splatting on your windshield as you're driving down the road. And so this was a very powerful tool that was viewed very positively from the military community. So for example, Brigadier General Kelvin Kopic, Director of Intelligence for Air Combat Command, stated that bug splat was, quote, a significant advance, as it will allow us to target those facilities we want to target with confidence that we're not going to cause collateral damage. And I think this is kind of really indicative of the idea that technology can solve these difficult ethical, political decisions in military decision making. And so what I wanted to explore is how the algorithm was written, how it was used across time, and the myth and discourse that started to evolve around it. So how did officials and decision makers talk about this versus how it's actually written? And then what are the outcomes and effects of that? And ultimately, I make the argument that ethical due care is simplified. It's no longer a kind of weighing of these moral positions, something that's always been reserved for the practical judgment of military and civilian commanders, but instead it's only a software update today. If collateral damage estimation tool fails to predict the accurate number of civilian casualties in a strike, then you're just a software update away and you get fast CD 2.0. So, give you a few more quotes. We already heard from Tommy Franks at that kind of opening salvo. But I think you see the ways in which it becomes a bit more complicated. So Major General Charles Dunlap, up there on the left, described the bug-splat algorithm system as, quote, a kabuki dance. Key assumptions could be adjusted so that estimates could stay below the specified level of political approval. For example, if a strike was predicted to have 31 civilian casualties, triggering White House review, it would be possible to adjust assumptions such that the recalculated numbers fell below 30 and thereby avoided presidential scrutiny. So you see, it's not actually about weighing the pros and cons, military necessity versus proportionality. It becomes a number by which to make decisions, right? And as I'll argue subsequently, it wasn't very good at generating those numbers. But you can see that if you're going to get political scrutiny, what you do then, maybe put a fuse delay on the bomb so that that number gets to 29 and you don't have to go to higher ups. Lieutenant General David Deptula also believed that, quote, modeling provides the ability to demonstrate to your political masters how you can achieve the results you want. You can lift these restraints if you can demonstrate the particular effects for specific weapons, and that will allow for greater application of force, end quote. So the concern here is not just with civilian harm, minimizing civilian harm. It's about ticking the box of political oversight. And finally, Brigadier General Kelvin Kopic, director, sorry, I already said that one. So you can see here, sorry, just lost it, 1 second. One of those nights. So you can see here the way it's utilized is a little bit detached from the way in which it's written. So if you're interested, you can go into more detail about the programming, but I identify in this article in Critical Military Studies 5 fundamental flaws of bug-splat. So the first fundamental flaw has to do with the ethics of war, and especially the ethics of due care. An arbitrary ceiling of 30 civilian casualties is not how ethics of war or the laws of war work. In some cases, 30 civilian casualties might be seen as acceptable based on the military necessity or the goals you're trying to achieve. For other strikes, it may be wholly disproportionate. So setting this number of 30 completely changes the decision-making of military practitioners for how they think about the ethics of war. 30 civilian casualties might be okay for some strikes, but not others. And if you're setting it at this place, then you can see as the quotes here, then they're going to fudge the numbers one way or another to avoid that kind of political scrutiny. With that too, you also have one problem that emerged in the Iraq War is that it tended to skew decision-making by Air Force officials. So if they had perhaps a legally questionable target, that this bug-splat algorithm turned out 0 civilian casualties, they would strike it. Right? If you had one that was of high military value, but turned out 50 civilian casualties, then you may take a step back and not strike it. So it's framing the ways in which military planners make their decisions and skewing it away from the idea of military necessity or the ends you're trying to achieve, and instead frames it in this dangerous thinking of whatever the algorithm says. Right? And the algorithm was fundamentally flawed because it was systematically designed to overestimate the bomb size you needed. Right? So the way in which it was initially designed and the legacy software system that it had was from the 1990s in Iraq. And the point was to ensure target destruction. Right? You wanted to make sure that if you had a given target, you put in a big enough bomb into it so that it would be destroyed. Makes perfect sense. What's interesting is that later, after the civilian casualty numbers got mapped onto it, the underlying algorithm itself didn't change. It was still skewing toward needing larger bomb sizes, but the discourse around it changed, right? The idea was that this is now a collateral damage estimation tool. This is to protect civilian life. So you have the baseline software, which tends to skew toward needing bigger bombs. And the discussion of it gives you the illusion that it's actually skewing towards smaller bombs, right? So this is where the kind of system overestimations come to be disconnected from the ways in which it's discussed. So this happens in technology quite a few times. Because we tend to treat technology like a black box. Right? We don't know why it outputs the decision that it does. We treat algorithms like they're kind of higher than human beings. When the computer turns out the number, it has to be right. And as one person from the Joint Warfare Analysis Center said of the Bugsplat algorithm, that what he tended to see was many military officials seeking a number by which to make a decision, no matter how unscientifically it was generated. Right? It's difficult to make decisions about life and death. We want to use all the tools that we can at our disposal. But one of the problems of that is if we don't fundamentally understand the technology, then we can use it in ways that it was unintended, and it can actually skew our decision making to make war perhaps more unethical than intended. The most shocking fundamental flaw, which I never realized until getting into this, was that the US Air Force never measured the actual number of civilian casualties and then used that data to retrain these algorithms. It was a wholly theoretical exercise. The civilian casualty numbers that were churned out by this algorithm were entirely theoretical. It was never retrained with real empirical data. So for example, if the algorithm said 0 civilians were killed, you were to do an investigation and actually 10 civilians were killed, how would you rewrite the algorithm to account for that? Right? It was never done. So you have this illusion of objectivity and scientism in this computer algorithm without actually feeding in any empirical data. And so this is a really dangerous thing, and we'll start to see that in the Paul Scher book about autonomy, is that we assume oftentimes that computers possess intelligence that it does not possess. We assume it has to be making the right decisions, and that we have this thing called an automation bias. No matter how much training you get, we tend to assume that the computer is doing something right, even when it's malfunctioning. So this idea of meaningful human control, which tends to be kind of like a panacea for all these kind of AI systems, if you just have meaningful human control, it will be ethical, it won't pose legal problems, all these things, is not actually a panacea, right? What happens is you're allowing these machines to absorb the legal and moral accountability for inevitable failures that come about. Right? This is the lesson that I took away from Bugsplat. So really, really fascinating. And you can see the ways in which technology is linked to ethics of war. A couple more quotes from the Iraq War that I wanted to point out. Donald Rumsfeld stated that our military capabilities are so devastating and precise that we can destroy an Iraqi tank under the bridge without damaging the bridge. We need not kill thousands of innocent Iraqis to remove Saddam Hussein from power. Right? So you see here, he is appealing to the technology itself rather than the actual outcomes of the war. We need not kill thousands of innocent Iraqis, but that's what happened in the end. Iraq War Navy Captain Arthur Cherbowski claimed that, quote, network-enabled armies kill more of the right people quicker. With fewer civilian casualties, warfare would be more ethical. As a result, the U.S. could use its military might to create free societies without being accused of imperialist arrogance. Right? So you can see here this idea that you are getting beyond the actual jus ad bellum or the ethics of going to war questions and saying this technology is so good, we inevitably will have an ethical war, and we can use military power to create free societies globally. So really, really fascinating mix, and I think this is the perfect example to see how a simple technology evolved across time, how humans interacted with this, and the psychology of human-machine interaction. And there is nothing more pertinent about understanding this appeal to technology than the US drone program. So the CIA conducted a minimum number of 14,000 confirmed strikes across Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia, and parts of Afghanistan after 2015. Before 2015 wasn't included in the data. Across these non-declared war zones. In fact, it first started in 2002 with George W. Bush in Yemen, and then quickly kind of escalated under the Obama presidency, where it became, quote unquote, the soul of the Obama presidency. So I just wanted to show you a quick graph that kind of demonstrates the immensity of Obama's kind of drone program. So as I pull it up here, you can see drone strikes in Pakistan only up until 2015, but you can really see the ways in which Bush's first attack in Pakistan in 2004 and Obama really, especially in 2010, massive number of strikes, right? And you can look at kind of each strike and see casualty numbers. Again, imperfect data, but I think it's a good demonstration for you to see the kind of number of strikes that took place. And so, again, this was a secret program. It was highly controversial. It was operated by the CIA in non-declared war zones in the war on terror. And what you have is, oops, let me get rid of that one. What you have is this covert drone warfare program that operates on the fringes of international law, that blurs the lines between areas of combat where conventional civilian law applies, or areas of combat where international humanitarian law or the laws of war apply, and civilian zones where international human rights law applies. There's this assumption that wherever terrorists operate, the U.S., the laws of war apply and the U.S. can operate. So here's a little bit, as you saw in 2010, massive amounts of drone strikes. And this was the first time that Obama in 2013 publicly acknowledged the U.S. drone program. And this is what he had to say about it.
Beyond the Afghan theater, we only target al-Qaeda and its associated forces. And even then, the use of drones is heavily constrained. America does not take strikes when we have the ability to capture individual terrorists. Our preference is always to detain, interrogate, and prosecute. America cannot take strikes wherever we choose. Our actions are bound by consultations with partners and respect for state sovereignty. America does not take strikes to punish individuals, we act against terrorists who pose a continuing and imminent threat to the American people, and when there are no other governments capable of effectively addressing the threat.
So you can see there his legal appeal. In order for preventive force to be justified, terrorists have to pose an imminent threat to the United States. So the critique of Obama's interpretation of imminent threat by terrorism came out in a 2013 leaked Department of Justice white paper, where essentially the Obama DOJ argued that terrorists pose an imminent threat to the United States at all times and in all places. And they cited a lack of evidence. We may not be aware of all plots out there, therefore, lethal force is justified. So you can see the way in which the idea of imminence was turned on its head in the war on terror in the program in order to provide legal justification. Let's continue on.
And before any strike is taken, there must be near certainty that no civilians will be killed or injured, the highest standard we can set. Now, this last point is critical because much of the criticism about drone strikes, both here at home and abroad, understandably centers on reports of civilian casualties.
So, not to get into kind of everything, if you want to look back in the New York Times, Scott Shane did a lot of good reporting in 2010 through 2013 on the kind of elements of the drone program. You can also look at Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch reports on drone strikes in Yemen and Pakistan. I think the only thing that I'll say here is that there's quite a bit of evidence that shows, contrary to what Obama just stated, the U.S. engaged in what was known as signature strikes. That is, where anyone fit the signature of a terrorist, being a military-age male, somewhere between the ages of 14 to 70, in certain areas, was automatically deemed an enemy killed in action unless it was proven after their death that they were civilians. So the ways in which we talk about drones being inherently accurate misses the kind of human interaction in which interpretation goes on in trying to understand and interpret who is a terrorist and who is not from the sky above.
There's a wide gap between U.S. assessments of such casualties and non-governmental reports. Nevertheless, it is a hard fact that U.S. strikes have resulted in civilian casualties, a risk that exists in every war. And for the families of those civilians, no words or legal construct can justify their loss. For me and those in my chain of command, those deaths will haunt us as long as we live, just as we are haunted by the civilian casualties that have occurred throughout conventional fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. But as Commander-in-Chief, I must weigh these heartbreaking tragedies against the alternatives. To do nothing in the face of terrorist networks would invite far more civilian casualties, not just in our cities at home and our facilities abroad, but also in the very places like Sana'a and Kabul and Mogadishu.
So you see here the way in which he frames it as either doing nothing or engaging in covert drone strike operations outside of declared war zones, right? And not only that, it saves our soldiers, which is why it always maintained high public support, right? There is no risk to soldiers, at least no physical risk. We'll talk about psychological risk and moral injury in a little bit. And not only that, it saves civilians in those areas from terrorists, right? Really, really kind of powerful appeal that we see a lot in law, science, and liberalism.
Where terrorists seek a foothold. Remember that the terrorists we are after target civilians, and the death toll from their acts of terrorism against Muslims dwarfs any estimate of civilian casualties from drone strikes. So doing nothing is not an option. Where foreign governments cannot or will not effectively stop terrorism in their territory, the primary alternative to targeted lethal action would be the use of conventional military options. As I've already said, even small special operations carry enormous risks. Conventional air power or missiles are far less precise than drones and are likely to cause more civilian casualties and more local outrage. And invasions of these territories lead us to be viewed as occupying armies, unleash a torrent of unintended consequences, are difficult to contain, result in large numbers of civilian casualties, and ultimately empower those who thrive on violent conflict. So it is false to assert that putting boots on the ground is less likely to result in civilian deaths or less likely to create enemies in the Muslim world. The results would be more U.S. deaths, more Black Hawks down, more confrontations with local populations, and an inevitable mission creep in support of such raids that could easily escalate into new wars. Yes, the conflict with al-Qaeda, like all armed conflict, invites tragedy. But by narrowly targeting our action against those who want to kill us and not the people they hide among, we are choosing the course of action least likely to result in the loss of innocent life. Our efforts must be measured against the history of putting American troops in distant lands among hostile populations. In Vietnam, hundreds of thousands of civilians died in a war where the boundaries of battle were blurred. In Iraq and Afghanistan, despite the extraordinary courage and discipline of our troops, thousands of civilians have been killed.
So you can see here that kind of historical appeal, and kind of the idea is that you either have Vietnam in Pakistan or Yemen, or you have drone strikes. So it's either doing nothing or drone strikes and or massive military full-scale invasion, right? So, you know, we don't have time to go into it. I encourage you, I already see one or two of you are working on your final papers for this, to look into this a little bit more. I don't want to say that the drone program, the CIA drone strike program, was a failure. The vast majority of those struck were not high-value targets. There were a number of civilian casualties, which in comparison to conventional conflict were lower. However, the bar and this appeal to technology means that there should be near zero, which is what civilian casualties, which is what the administration was asserting in their decision-making to take strikes, and that was not the case. So ultimately, full cards on the table. I don't think necessarily that the program was completely ineffective. I agree that you can't do nothing about this, but what it turned into in the end, especially at its kind of peak, was searching for targets and taking out low-level militants with massive amounts of expenditure and air power without seeing any kind of tangible results. So really, really mixed. And again, what bothers me most is the appeal to technology itself, rather than actually trying to figure out the ends of war, how you win a conflict like this. So in the blog post you read by Derek Gregory, he looks at Gregoire Chamayou's theory of the drone book and kind of breaks down a few different things. So this is looking at a specific bomb, the NK-84, and how it has changed in precision over time. This is also a laser painting where you want to hit a specific target, and they get into the kind of difference between laser-guided bombs, Hellfire missiles, etc. But I think this is what's most interesting, and we'll talk about this in Maya Zafis's piece next week. But if you have a 50% circular error probable, it means with your average bomb, you are going to hit your target or within a certain amount of meters from your target 50% of the time. So it means it's accurate but imprecise. Inaccurate and imprecise means it would look like this over here, completely missing your target. Accurate and precise means you hit all bullseyes. Inaccurate and imprecise is here. And so there's this idea that these are surgical strikes. So, for example, John Brennan, former CIA director, talking about the drone, described it as, quote, "It's this surgical precision, the ability with laser-like focus to eliminate the cancerous tumor called an Al-Qaeda terrorist while limiting damage to the tissue around it that makes this counterterrorism tool so essential." Right? This kind of language that you are doing surgery, that you have a scalpel, not that these are Hellfire missiles. And as Killingwell talked about too, the Hellfire missile is an anti-tank munition. It's got a kill radius of 50 feet, a wound radius of 65 feet. These are anti-tank munitions being hurled at individuals on the ground. And there were also accusations of double tap strikes, etc. And so what's interesting is the way in which, again, the myth of the technology is discussed. This ability to somehow mythically distinguish between combatant and non-combatant is in fact a myth. It abolishes the conditions necessary for such a distinction, combat itself. Right? Now, what that's saying here is that the lines in the war on terror have been so blurred between war and non-war that you don't actually know what laws apply. Obama asserts that the laws of war apply wherever terrorists operate, and there is no temporal bound to it. That was a Bush expansion that Obama continued, and Trump continued, and even Biden continued, even though their use of drones greatly diminished. Right? It seems to solve these kind of complex ethical and legal dilemmas. Yeah. It's legally questionable when you can engage militarily in non-declared war zones just because a country is unwilling or unable to stop terrorism from within its borders. Right? This is controversial in international law. The declaration of imminence, the imminent threat that all terrorists pose at all times. This language of surgical and kind of medical language of these types of strikes doesn't match the reality of it. And we'll talk about another fun program called Skynet here shortly. So in the end, what you get is you're conflating the tactics of war with a prescription of normative judgments. You are saying we are using this technology to kill, therefore we are ethical. So you're getting appeals to technical process, not the actual outcomes of war. You have this assumption that the fog of war has been lifted by technology, and you divorce what actually happens on the battlefield from the outcome. And ultimately, I think I argue that in the end, what you have is a neglecting the ends of war by focusing on perfecting the means of war. And so I wanted to share real quick this idea that somehow this type of war could be risk-free, because it's not actually risk-free. It may be risk-free in the sense that one does not put their bodies on the line if you are operating a drone halfway across the world, but you definitely put your mind on the line. High rates of PTSD, similar to that of active duty combat, of some drone pilots. This is one interview with Brandon Bryant, U.S. Air Force drone pilot, so not part of the CIA program, that describes one of his strikes that he undertook.
There's two guys in front, one guy in the rear. They're walking up this path, and the two guys in front are discussing. You can see them having an avid conversation. They've got something slung over their shoulders, which look to be weapons. Mountainous portions of Afghanistan are not so unsimilar from the mountainous regions of Montana. And seeing people with guns walking around the mountains of Afghanistan was like, well, people are walking with guns in the mountains of Montana. But as soon as we get eyes on them, it's like immediately confirm door weapons, confirm your cleared target. So place the target at their feet and we get missiles away, ends up getting all three of them. But the guy in the back, it ends up cutting his leg off above the knee and severing his femoral artery. And he's rolling around, he's holding it, and he's just like rolling around, but you can see like where his leg is missing and the blood is spurting out and landing on the ground, and it's cooling. It's hot, it's a hot pool of blood, and it's cooling. And we keep eyes on and watch the guy become the same color as the ground that he bled out on. I could almost see his facial expression. It was, I can almost see his mouth open and crying out. Maybe he cursed us, or maybe he asked Allah for forgiveness for us. Who knows what his last thoughts were, but it wasn't pretty, whatever it was. It was shock and trauma, and his ears were probably ringing, and he was bleeding out, and he was in agony. I didn't know how to react. No one teaches you how to react. They teach you how to do it. They ignore the reaction part. I wished I never contributed further to that.
So while this may not be the experience of all drone pilots, I think it is important, and it raises this kind of issue of what technology means and what risk-free warfare means. All right? So you can see here, there's a phrase by John Williams at Durham University called distant intimacy. Right? The idea that you can be operating a drone on the other side of the world and be the furthest distance away, have no physical risk to yourself. But you can see here, but this was a very intimate killing process. Right? Oftentimes in the battlefield, some of the Marines that I've interviewed in the past at UC Irvine talked about, oftentimes you wouldn't even see, you would just be throwing lead down the range. Right? You wouldn't see your enemy. And so it's strange that you can be on the ground, your body is at risk, fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan, and somehow in that you have a less intimate experience with those that you're killing, right? Again, not always the case, but it's an interesting kind of puzzle to think through. And what are the implications of that? Lindsay Clark also has some great work looking at and interviewing drone pilots, especially in the United Kingdom, looking at some of the dilemmas that they face. It's a strange thing where when you're on shift, you're in a war zone. And then as you come off shift, you're getting texts like pick up milk, take the kids to soccer practice. And it's a real blurring of the war front and the home front. So really, really fascinating moral dilemmas for our soldiers. So I want to get next to one of the most fascinating elements of the CIA targeting program in Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia. This was General Michael Hayden, who said in an offhanded quote back in 2013, "We kill people based on metadata." So this launched an entire line of inquiry for me, which ultimately led me to understand a program known as Skynet. Yes, the malevolent AI from the Terminator movies was actually the name of the program that the US used in Yemen and Pakistan. So the way in which this worked, it was a joint CIA and NSA program that would fly over the tribal areas of Pakistan and gather up the SIM card metadata straight from the sky of 50 million cell phone users in Pakistan. From that, it would go back to NSA headquarters and run through an algorithm to look at pattern of life, social network, travel behavior, in order to give a numeric score of one's probability of terroristness, right? You are reduced to a number of a probability of terroristness. So these are the leaked slides from a number of years back, 2015. that shows the highest scoring selector on this program was actually an Al Jazeera journalist. So he was miscategorized as a top scorer for terrorism. And so this Skynet program is really fascinating because it looks at the use of big data, where everything is considered suspicious. And since we can't understand where the next terrorist attack may be, we want to quantitatively solve that problem. So we give you a numerical score of a probability of terroristness. Right? So this undermines kind of traditional understandings of risk and ethics of war, in that we are trying to calculate the way in which you pose some type of risk to the United States. So this is an interesting phenomenon, in that, you know, the way in which big data works is different than traditionally the way in which mathematics and statistics has worked. And so it's fascinating because when you have an entire population of data, patterns start to emerge. This is Stats 101. Just because you have a bell curve doesn't mean you can tell anything about an individual on that bell curve in stats. And the same thing is true for gathering up big data on these SIM cards. Essentially, you get a lethal death sentence based on correlation. I hope all of you know already taking does not equal causation, and yet that was the sole basis upon which sometimes U.S. Covert strikes were taking place. And so even you have this n equals all, where all humans, and especially in certain areas, are suspect, and your humanity and your right to life is reduced to metadata constructions of who you might be, based on, do you power your phone down frequently? Do you only have incoming calls? Do you travel? Do you swap out your SIM cards regularly? Kind of all of these were factors that were calculated in this kind of elusive Skynet algorithmic program. But you can see the appeal to this, right? You're using a high-tech solution to find people who may or may not pose a threat amongst high-tech, or hiding amongst a population. But so there's this kind of paradox that takes place because you get this production of ethics. You get this paradox where you think you're targeting an individual in this drone strike, but what you're actually targeting is a shadow of a person. You're targeting a metadata construction of an individual. The who of who you're killing becomes a what, which is a correlation of random numbers generated. And so these kind of cases that I went over today shows the ways in which technology can tick the ethical box and absolve decision makers of the real kind of weight of decision making and the weight of killing. Judgment, which should be reserved for experts, decision makers to kind of weigh the pros and cons, and many do quite well. Look, these are exceptional cases. I'm not trying to say that, decision makers don't weigh the kind of moral judgments, but computation offers a way out of this difficult moral weight of deciding to kill, right? This is something that humans have an aversion to. So if we can outsource that to computation, there's a real kind of appeal for this. So this idea that you can prevent terrorist attacks before they're happening really turns into a fact that you can promote suspicion of anyone and everyone within a certain geographic area. And it gives it this kind of scientific calculus of probabilities, when in fact, a lot of the underlying assumptions don't work, or a lot of the underlying software and structures might lead you astray because you think that they work in a certain way that they don't. So what you get is an accelerated decision-making in the war on terror, which don't necessarily lead to ultimately positive outcomes or victories in war. Some things are meant to be meaningfully inefficient. It's not just about the efficient ordering of warfare. So, for example, democracy is very inefficient, right? But we view that as a core value. Some things should happen slowly. Weighing life, right? Whether or not to send your troops into a particular objective. The risk may be high, but the military necessity might be high as well, right? That's a difficult moral burden that you as a commander have to bear. And so it's this kind of weighing of these things that you can't necessarily outsource to computational ethics. And so where does that get us with the idea of killer robots that you're starting to explore in Paul Scher's article, or in Paul Scher's book, Army of None? Looking at different levels of autonomy, humans in the loop, humans off the loop, full autonomy. How do we kind of understand this? And so I think the appeal of drones, but especially the idea of drones without that kind of human in the loop or on the loop pressing the button, of fully autonomous drones making these decisions and targeting the bad guys. It gives you this illusion that there's this kind of perfect rationality, a kind of godlike view that others have talked about, Donna Haraway specifically in 1988 and Lauren Wilcox in 2017. It's kind of God trick that you have this kind of omnipotent power that has a view simultaneously of everywhere and nowhere. But what this misses is the key of emotion in making moral decisions, right? There's this idea that reason and emotion are in conflict, and that if you have this kind of pure reasoning being or AI chip, that somehow it will make better decisions than humans, because humans get emotional, they have biases, they get scared, they pull the trigger too easily, etc. But emotion is also key for making moral decisions, right? Pity or empathy are also emotions, right? That recognition of self and other, right? This kind of classic example from Michael Walzer's Just and Unjust Wars, talking about the unethical behavior of the sniper targeting the bathing soldier, right? The soldier is taking a bath in the river, they're naked, they don't pose a threat to you. Sure, they're going to pick up their arms later, but he talks about the kind of moral aversion that we have to targeting someone in that respect, right? There's something wrong about targeting someone while they're naked, right? Even if they will pose a threat to you in the future. So emotion is not necessarily a bad thing, especially in moral decision making. But the thing about killer robots is that they lack agency. And this is why autonomy is so dangerous, because robots lack the decision or the capacity to do otherwise. The decision, even when you're legally allowed to not pull the trigger. Right? Just because you can doesn't mean you should. So the idea of the human in the loop and human on the loop that Paul Scher talks about, especially I want to point out, page 43 through 47 on the OODI loop, and the difference between semi-autonomous, supervised autonomous, and fully autonomous weapon system. I think this should give us a little bit of pause today in the examples that I showed, the way in which humans and machines interact. Just having a human to say yes, target, or no, don't target, misses the ways in which the psychology of humans and computers interact. And so what I want to kind of do is close out this lesson with the kind of technologics of contemporary war ethics. We're caught in this idea that we can solve the problems of war, and especially the moral dilemmas of taking life, through technology. Right? In that, we've come to focus on the means of war, the weapons we use, the technology, the level of tech we use to kill, rather than the ends of war. What are the political objectives you're trying to achieve? And the consequence of this is that it dissolves these major ethical political dilemmas into engineering problems to be solved, not debated in a collective political process or weighed in the kind of practical judgment of ethics of war. So there's this false assumption that war is somehow inherently more ethical and less bloody just because we use advanced technology to kill. And we have this myth that somehow we are able to individualize war and only kill the bad guys. So what I want to kind of leave you with is that there's this idea that in the name of the myth of the absolute eradication of risk, understood as the eruption of the unpredictable, instead what we do is construct massive new risks, which constitute new targets for preventive action. Right? There's this idea that you can kill one individual, but if you launch this massive campaign with kind of no end and no bounds, it can actually end up having a negative effect in the long term. So what we see is, again, appeals to technological process and not the outcomes. And we have certain assumptions about what AI is capable of, and the ability of meaningful human control, which I think these cases should raise doubts in. Have this idea that we can absolutely eradicate risk with technology and prevent terrorist acts or wars happening prior to their occurrence. So think of the kind of classic Tom Cruise movie Minority Report, which I think is worth a watch again. The scientific war is possible. So what I hope you gain from this is some interesting empirical cases to add to the ones that you've been reading throughout the book about the evolution of warfare from the first Gulf War to the more contemporary era, and see the way in which AI kind of appeals to this desire for what we've been discussing in law, science, and liberalism, to have the ethical war with technology kind of squaring that circle. So I hope you all enjoyed this. Please take time on your quizzes and reflections and go through this. I really look forward to reading your papers as the semester goes on. So thank you so much. Have a good one.